right, so we finished the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the sin of Lot's daughters who committed incest with their father. Always remember, Scripture describes exactly what happens, whether it is good or bad. It simply tells you what has taken place. And we note at the end of it that the result of their sin were people that plagued Israel in later generations, the Moabites and the Ammonites. They became some of the worst of the pagan tribes, worshiping the idols of Molech, passing their children, sacrificing their own children in the fire, and so forth. Okay, and so we continue on. Chapter 20. So, Abraham is still in Palestine, of course, but he left that area where the valley of Sodom, where the cities were that were destroyed. So, beginning in 20, from there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." And so once again, he does the same thing here that he had done in Egypt with Pharaoh, to similar result. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. You have to remember, this is the way the kings operated. If they saw a woman that they wanted as a wife, they would simply take her. This is the way it was.
Wasn't she really old then?
Yeah, but she was still beautiful. She was old, but she was beautiful. She was past the age of childbearing, but it didn't mean she was old and wrinkly looking. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man, because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, "Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'? And she herself said, 'He is my brother'? In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her." And so, in other words, God protected Sarah and Abimelech both from committing adultery. "Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, and all who are yours." So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. And so Abraham's sin became public knowledge, and the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" In other words, that you're reacting in this way. How did you know? And it's also interesting here that even the pagan nations knew that adultery was wrong, that a man's wife belonged to that man, and he to her, and that it was a great sin to commit adultery. Even pagan nations understood this thing. This is so not just marriage, but the sacredness of marriage is something that God has built into our hearts, so that we understand this by nature as part of the law written upon our hearts. And so Abraham said, "I did it because I thought that there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." So Sarah was his half-sister. "And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do to me. At every place in which we come, say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen." So it makes you wonder if we're only told of two such instances when this happened, but that there were perhaps even more. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before you. Dwell wherever it pleases you. And he said to Sarah, Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. And so he's even watching out for Sarah's reputation, even. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So you wonder how long this went on, if it was long enough for them to notice that his entire household had stopped bearing children. All right. And finally, after all of these years, the promise of God is fulfilled. Yes, Isaiah?
But he said he hadn't touched Sarah.
That's what I said, yes. Yep.
So how can we know it's been going on for long?
Because it was long enough for them to know that all of the women of the household were barren. So it had to be a significant enough time for that. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Remember, he said, this time next year you will have a son. This is what God said, the final visit prior to the birth of Isaac, when he came right before the time of Sodom and Gomorrah. So you got an idea of the time frame here now. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Isaac bore him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac, which seems to be, the name seems to be related to the word for laughter. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears me will laugh over me. And he said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne a son in his old age. I have borne him a son in his old age. And so, again, what happened here, everybody would have recognized as impossible. That a woman who is nearly 100 years old, and a man is 100 years old, would bear children. And so it was necessary that God make it absolutely clear that the only way this child Isaac could be born was according to his power and promise. And so Isaac becomes a type of Christ, an impossible birth. And so it foreshadows how Christ's birth, how the birth of Jesus, was an impossible birth that only could take place according to the power and promise of God. In the case of Jesus, a virgin birth. And in the case of Abraham and Sarah, a birth when no birth is possible. Both so similar in that way. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Probably laughing in mockery is all we can imagine. By now, this son is grown. He's probably a teenager or so. Or maybe in his 20s. I can't remember the exact time frame now from when he was born to this. But. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son. For the son of the slave woman will not be heir with my son Isaac. And so God used Sarah to speak a prophecy. So, how's the prophecy? We need to go to the book of Galatians, where Paul says, these things happened as a type, as an allegory. For Hagar and Isaac Sarah and Isaac, Hagar and Ishmael are a type of the two covenants. The old covenant of the law, and then the covenant of the gospel of promise. That if you remain a child of the covenant of the law, and you hope to find your salvation in the law, you will be cast out. The son of the slave will not be heir together with the son of the free. And so the law kept all men, particularly Israel, in bondage. They could not keep the law. They could not be saved by the law. They could only be saved by the promise. The law is fleshly in that sense. It governs our flesh. Ishmael was a son according to the flesh, not according to promise. There was nothing miraculous at all about Ishmael's birth. Isaac was the son of promise. And it is only through God's grace that Isaac was able to be born. And so he became a type of the promise of Christ. It is only by the grace of God, and it is indeed an impossible thing, just as impossible as the birth of Isaac was, that we ourselves can be brought into the promise and saved. It can only take place by the power of God and not by any doing of or arranging of our own. All right. So Sarah said this, and this thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. He loved Ishmael. Ishmael was his son. He didn't want his son cast out. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Do whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for though through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." God keeps his promise to be a father of many nations, even when in the case of Ishmael, this was man attempting to take God's promise into their own hands, and yet God still remained faithful to his own promise. For the sake of Abraham, he made Ishmael into a great nation. So Abraham arose early in the morning, and he took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and he sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child, so must not quite be a teenager yet, the way it's describing this. She put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." So Hagar was convinced that they're going to die here in the desert. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of the Lord called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for the Lord has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up and lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt.
Do we know what nation he fathered Ishmael?
Not precisely, but based upon the territory, it would have probably been the ancestors of, a number of Middle Eastern people. People often look at Ishmael as being the father of what later became the Muslim tribes. And the Muslims in general look back to Ishmael as their ancestor.
Interesting.
At least the Middle Eastern Muslims. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol the commander, Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, "God is with you in all that you do." So this is the same Abimelech that we heard in chapter 20. God is with you in all that you do. And remember, Abraham was he wasn't just a small little family. Even though he only had with him now one natural born son, he had a huge, successful household. Enough that he could be an army of his own, as we saw in the case of rescuing the kings of the plain, of the valley, from their enemies. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land with where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. When Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. And you did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. And so here Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore the place was called Beersheba. And Beersheba, Shiva is the Hebrew word for 7, and Beer is the word for well, Be'er. And so Beersheba is named after, which the Beersheba that we hear later in the New Testament was named after this treaty. Because Abraham himself had dug the well and some of Abimelech's servants had taken it. So they named it Beersheba to remember the oath that they both swore there. And so they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, arose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines.
And so what is this tamarisk tree?
Tamarisk.
I don't know. It's a tree. It's a tree of some kind. I don't know what kind it is.
I'm just wondering what the symbolism is with, like...
The only symbolism would be that it was a tree that probably didn't grow in that region, so you would see it and it would stand out, so that you would, so the whole point of doing these things, or when they would build an altar or set up a pillar of stones as a memorial. We have memorials to this day, but in their case they were more meaningful because we'll put a memorial anywhere, but they would often place memorials for significant events at specific places so that in the future you would see it and remember what took place there. So the tree was functioning, had that purpose. All right, chapter 22 gets into the sacrifice of Isaac, and we want to take a bit more time on that, so we'll stop there. And we're nearing the end of Abraham's story is coming up.